Hi everybody, if you don't know me, I am Ryan Steens. I am the community manager for Avalon. I spend about 60% of my time on that, about 40% of my time on other Samvera related activity. And so I am very interested in all of Samvera and how all of it is going. A while back, Nabila and I started talking about a DSpace to Samvera migration interest group, and we set it up. We had some meetings and kind of decided what we really wanted to do with that was have this presentation. Fairly accurate? Okay, close enough. Okay. So in this session, we want to take a little bit of a look at the landscape of what's going on out there in the world, and think about what we need to do as a community to help other people along to get them if they want to use Samvera. There's a whole lot of other technologies out there, some very particular ones that we know our colleagues are using. So what are those challenges facing all of those people as they look at Samvera? What are the hoops and hurdles that they've got to get through? We're also going to take a look at some of the excellent work that came out of the Bridge to Haiku grant that's been going on at the University of Houston and now a little bit beyond. And some successes that have taken place in DSpace migration and what's going on with bpress. So one of the things I was very interested in is if we think of Samvera as I know it's a framework, but let's pretend for a minute it's a competing product, and it kind of is, right? So Content DM is something a whole lot of our colleagues are using. There's 2,000 users out there. I saw a statistic that 60%, and some of these numbers are pulled, by the way, from the Hydra in a Box grant. So some of these numbers may be a little bit old, but some of them I got from Hannah. We know that there's more than 1,000 registered DSpace installations, and I guarantee you there's probably 3 or 4 times more that are unregistered out there in the world. And a lot of folks have multiple DSpaces at their institutions. The numbers I found for bpress were a little shaky, but it said it was about 500 people were using digital commons. Figshare is really hard to tell because they like to tout how much data they've got, but they don't like to talk at all about how many installations they've got if you start digging around. Islandora, I don't know how many of you guys talk to your ULs, but they kind of often think of Fedora having like 2 flavors. One's Islandora and one's Samvera. So they're kind of our friends, but they also are the closest thing to us out there, and there's 258 of those according to the 2018 annual report. And we know that there are 37 partners? There's 34 partners. I'm not sure how it ended up as 37. Did something change in the past couple days? No? Okay, that's my typo. I'm very sorry. And a whole bunch more CLAs. I know that we're going to have some more folks becoming partners this year, so maybe that'll be right in a couple of months. Yep. I guess that's it. That's all my slides. Okay, Nabila.
This one's on. Okay, so this is going to be real quick. So with Content DM, we found at the Bridge to Haiku project, we've been doing kind of messaging people that are using Content DM and finding out what are the reasons they're looking to move off of it. For larger institutions, it's that they've sunsetted the local support. So if you've had a local instance of Content DM, they're no longer doing that. They're moving to all hosted. For smaller institutions, there is Content DM has an unlimited license level that is a pretty big jump from the smaller ones. And then for smaller institutions, it's a closed source. So there's a difference between being like a Samvera thing where it's community versus being a users group and you're just kind of complaining about what you can't do and trying to hack what you can at that. So those are the challenges that we found with Content DM, and then you are going to talk about DSpace.
Okay, so I'm Josh Gum from Oregon State University, and I'm a tech lead in a group that manages our institutional repository. And when I started at OSU, we were talking about migrating off of DSpace. And at the time, it was to Sophia, which eventually became Hyrax by the time we finished that whole project. And so some of the reasons that we wanted to migrate, it's really, first of all, we want to contribute to the open source community. And we want to have, we want to kind of simplify our processes and support. One of the other applications that is kind of initially based on early versions of Hydra is called Oregon Digital. And so there's this benefit to minimizing the different things that we support. So Scholars Archive, our institutional repository, and Oregon Digital in the near future will be more in line with each other. So those are some of the reasons that we decided to migrate. Our migration really came down to just a belt and suspenders approach. It was, we could do the bag export from DSpace, chop those bags up, grab the metadata, force the binaries in basically uploading directly to the Hyrax application, submit the metadata, and then let the background jobs take over from there. It was a very slow going process for migrating the 65,000 items that we had, but, and there are some trade-offs that we accepted along the way that are gonna come up in future slides. But it did eventually happen, and a byproduct of all of this work is the DSpace to Hydra code. Some of it is tailored more to our specifics for PCDM, the parent-to-child relationships for works, but it's a good starting point, and we're definitely willing to help if people have questions.
So I'm Nabila Jaffer at University of Michigan, and we are in the process of planning to move from DSpace to Hyrax. We have our Deep Blue data, which is on Hyrax, and some of you were already in the Deep Blue data presentation, so this screen might seem like a duplicate. So what happens is the Deep Blue is the branding we have been doing for a long time. And whenever anybody goes on deepblue.live.umich.edu, this is the page that comes up, which is like, now Deep Blue is expanding, the data is there's a portal for Deep Blue data, and then there is for documents. So as of now, when you click on the documents one, it takes you to the DSpace instance, and this is something we are working on, is having DSpace, instead of DSpace, having one portal for both, which is like we are working on making this kind of Unity project. So the name we say is Debug, Deep Blue Unity Group, which is kind of informal. Okay. So for us, when we were building the MVP, we found out that we are not ready to migrate to Hyrax because Hyrax does not have all the features that currently our users are used to, or even the administrators, the service manager for the Deep Blue, the DSpace repo, whatever he needs, we don't have those. And some of those features that we found out are missing in Hyrax that we really need before we migrate to Hyrax from DSpace are the browsing feature, the tombstone, and the work types are, so the Hyrax 2 has different work types, but it's not really linked with collections. And those of you who are familiar with DSpace would know that it's very collection-based. Also, like request a copy, Morse custom stats, CNRI handle manager. Don't ask me what that is because Jose was supposed to do these slides and I'm just filling in for him. So this is something in DSpace, I guess. REST API, SORD, and OAIP image. So there are like a bunch of more features too. IP address restrictions. So as of now, we have implemented the cosign for Deep Blue data. We'll be using the same one. But there is nothing like if somebody logs in, then we don't know that who that person is and what collection that person has access to. So this is what is currently there in DSpace, and this is something we are hoping to integrate in DSpace, somehow have those groups on IP. Pronouns metadata for works and files, ability to set IP range embargoes, and we'll be using some of the OSU scripts because they have already done the work. So thank you. And now I'll give it to Todd.
So the Bridge to Haiku grant is piggybacked off of the Hydra in a Box grant to kind of help create a toolkit and documentation around migration to make it easier for institutions that might not have the development resources to kind of modify Haiku or Hyrax or easily get at their stuff in Content DM. So we've created a CDM bridge. I had a poster yesterday. It is a desktop application that pulls with the Open API in Content DM. It pulls out your metadata. It also crosswalks. Currently, it has the generic work metadata that's in Haiku Hyrax, but you can customize it in any way you want. Next, we have HyBridge, which is a Ruby gem that is on the UI of Haiku that we've built that goes to any data source that the consortia wants to point to, and it easily does the batch ingest through the Haiku. We are currently, literally this week, we've been working on the pilot with TDL on that. We have a website that we're going to be writing documentation on, kind of the best practices around crosswalking, deciding what you need to move, and everything else. And the end of phase 2 is spring of 2019, so that is when we're going to have the public beta tasting of the CDM bridge, although you should go check it out. If you do have if you have Content DM now, you should play around with it. Yep. And successes. So I don't know who was going to talk about that. I know at U of H we have successfully moved from Content DM to Avalon for our AV. Should we just move it around?
Yeah, and I guess like I was talking about earlier, we've moved DSpace. I'm looking at Margaret because I wonder, there was a lot of work that was done to move Content DM, and would that, does that kind of show up as a success too?
Yes, I would say so. We wrote the Baggett scripts.
Okay.
Just tell them about Baggett.
Yeah, so OSU, our GitHub has some information about Baggett, and it was used to migrate out of Content DM.
Harvester. So currently we have the Bridge to Haiku toolkit. Does anyone else? And you were using the Baggett. You just said the OSU has that GitHub. Technical challenges. Yeah.
All right. So I'm George Wheeler from Notch 8, and I just kind of wanted to go over some of the technical challenges that we've kind of observed, both at kind of high level and some specific use cases that we've run into. There's obviously, like, if we're looking at people coming into the Samvera community and they, maybe don't have the same resources or a large development team, Haiku looks like a pretty attractive option, but the question for them is, do they do hosted or local instances? And how much of that effort can be just pulled from the community instead of having to rehash and refigure out how to spin an instance up and how to make that scale and whatnot, and what some of the technical challenges are that are there. Some of the other ones are kind of awaiting for Valkyrie, especially just with the conversations that I've heard throughout this week. It's been really encouraging for me, at least, to kind of see that that's moving in a direction of kind of decoupling whatever that permanent storage backend is. But that still raises some pretty heavy questions for those who are either on an older version or are looking to kind of migrate in, which leads us to kind of figuring out, like, as a third-party kind of vendor and someone who doesn't have the same stake in the data, but definitely wants to help people move across quickly, figuring out like what some of those migration paths are. We've done a couple already, and that kind of gives us a unique place to say, hey, here's what works, here's what doesn't, and kind of work out some of those kinks, because we end up getting a little bit more practice than kind of the average. Obviously, there's the file migration versus metadata migration and how we handle that. And then another one that kind of bleeds into more the cultural but also technical challenge, which is mitigating and balancing the risk for smaller teams, or kind of the inverse of that, which is just large data sets. And what that process looks like, creating non-developer friendly tooling for the mapping and the migration of the metadata, bulk import-export, which we've done a lot of talk about, and then async jobs, cancellation, progress indicators. It's kind of hard to go to a stakeholder and say, hey, we need to perform this migration, and there's no way to kind of really estimate how long that's taking or where you're at in that progress, aside from, I don't know, there's 50,000, 200,000 works, and we're through this many. That doesn't always help, because the size of those and how much background processing is very different. The other thing that for me personally is something that I'd like to see a little bit of discussion on is this concept of like job cancellation. The current build of Hyrax has a lot of instances where a job spins a job spins a job. And that's really nice. I think that's cool, but we run into this problem that if I cancel the parent job, those other child jobs just sit in the queue. And there's currently no real good way to kind of back that up and start over, or to back that up and cancel a job, or to change the mapping and then run it again as you're kind of figuring this out. So that's something that I'd like to kind of see happen as well. So just click. Awesome. So obviously there's a little bleed there, but at Notch 8, we're also really interested in kind of some of the cultural challenges and seeing where we can help with that. The inertia and speed of like larger teams that can process, you know, a large job, or a better way to say that, you got a large team, you've got more developers, you can get through this a little bit quicker. But with smaller teams, I think it's kind of a point of this community that we don't forget those that maybe aren't represented here, or that don't have the same resources, right? So there's kind of a balance between trying to move quickly, but also not break everything all the time. We still have stakeholders that we need to kind of be accountable to. Another thing that I had an awesome opportunity to talk about with a few people earlier this week is still that there's kind of a little bit of a gap at times between the developer-driven kind of direction of things and the library, specifically metadata librarian needs, and that sometimes there isn't maybe as much communication as we'd like. And I look at being kind of third party on the outside of that and being able to potentially help with some of that. Yeah.
I think that's it for all of our slides. So what we really wanted to do was kind of open up the floor for things that you're doing locally, concerns that you have locally, and maybe start thinking a little bit as a community. And I know it's almost 5 o'clock on the second to last day of the conference, but start thinking a little bit about what can we actually do together to start closing some of these gaps. So what are, I mean, we have Ubiquity Press here. I'm going to go ahead and wander over towards Brian and make him talk. So you guys are thinking a little about doing some migrations, correct?
So one that you didn't have up there was ePrints. So we have an ePrints migration starting now, and we'll be producing tools for that. And then the next thing up for us will be bpress. So we have a couple of pilot partners who are on bpress and plotting to get off as quickly as they can. So that will be the next thing we challenge. And one of the key things is we'll make all of the tools open source and available. Something that concerned me a little bit in the last few days was hearing about some of the service providers on other platforms that keep the tools closed access, closed source, and that seems like a real shame. Certainly one of the things we plan to do is make everything open and community available.
As you guys have been looking at this, does this ring true for any of you? Who is thinking about migrations right now? Can I get a show of hands? Okay. And what of any of this looked familiar? What did this look like to you guys? Is this pretty much what you're seeing? I know, pointing at one of the slides or two of the slides I guess Nabila had, where they outlined all of the different features that they're looking for. Are those things that are also showstoppers for any of you out there? Things like SWORD, OAI, PMH, things like that? Yeah. You're building OAI, PMH? Oh. Okay. Is there any interest in spinning up a migrations interest or working group? Is that something anyone has capacity for? Yes? Great, you're the chair. Too late.
I've got some other responsibilities coming up, but I would be interested in an interest group.
There's the Hydra migrations one. So
It's on. It was.
it was
There
okay.
you go.
So there is the Hydra migrations. That's the channel on Slack, Hydra / migrations. It's content DM focused, but it doesn't have to be. I know you had the DSpace one, but we could always just use that Slack channel for a less specific interest group.
So a really popular topic here is Valkyrie and what it provides. And one of the ideas that's been floated for that is the idea of having a read-only adapter so that you can basically spin up a Hyrax instance, and then as necessary, the objects are read from your older system and then put into the new system automatically as they're accessed. And I think that as lowering the bar for migration pain might be, I think that'll be a good selling point.
Can you actually talk a little bit more about that? Like every time something's clicked on, it moves over?
Yeah, when for instance, the user interface, somebody does a search and it comes back and they give a full view of the object, then you could do in the background kick off a transfer because you already loaded it.
Okay. Has anybody else been thinking about Valkyrie and how it might also play into this? Has anybody?
Esme is here. Esme, do you have any thoughts on Valkyrie? It's the perfect crowd.
Sure. I mean, we're definitely migrating things internally from old mods, metadata, and various other ancient systems, not any of these systems that other people are using. But we're definitely thinking about how we can make Valkyrie work in Hyrax, how we can let people migrate, especially data from Fedora 3. We know there's a lot of people still using Fedora 3. and thinking about maybe read-only adapters, which is something Valkyrie hasn't had to date, might make it easier to implement only the features you need to list and extract records, for example, and not the full read-write support. So we're definitely thinking about what we can do. Yeah, I think that's the main thing.
Does anybody have any questions for the folks on the panel? Has anybody seen the Bridge to Haiku adapter? Have you guys actually seen that yet? Raise your hands if you've seen it. Yeah, it's really interesting, and it's one of those. Can you actually have the ability to pull it up right now?
I don't really want it on their personal laptop.
Okay.
Any of that.
I have a quick question. So I had a quick question. When we migrated from DSpace to Scholars Archive, one of our driving goals was metadata remediation and changing the shape of the data as well. And so that really drove the creation of a lot of code and a lot of this logic. Do you all, and I'm looking at Esme, have experience in doing the same sort of thing, or is it like one-to-one? I'm moving, title to title, or here's the problem. Our DSpace instance had all kinds of data in the description field, and so we ended up with these regex to, it's actually a graduation date, so we're going to put that into a more meaningful, field.
Yeah, I definitely have experience with that. As we migrate from old METS files and mods files, we're finding lots of places where we want to either expand our models or parse the data that's in there and carve things up in different ways. And that's always a thing. I think anytime you migrate between systems, you find little incongruities there where the granularity of the fields doesn't quite map up, or you have more functionality, or maybe your metadata practices have evolved over the years, and so you have, data that's not homogeneous that you have to deal with in different ways. So I definitely think that's a thing that is a big deal, and something that has to be handled in any of these toolkits. I think that's really a lot of the hard part of metadata migration, is dealing with that, especially the heterogeneous data problem where you look at a few sample records and you think things are great, and then you run it at scale and you find a significant chunk of things that have fields you didn't know about, or different data practices that don't fit the way the migration worked. And it takes a lot of time and effort to be able to just review all of those and figure out what are the good records that tell you the variety of things. So I think when you're making interfaces for these things, being able to handle large scale, things like OpenRefine kind of interfaces to let people see the variety of data, I think is a really powerful thing.
Todd, I don't want to pick on you, but how does Bridge to Haiku think about those things?
Bridge to Haiku is mainly going to have documentation and best practices surrounding that, and we're still writing that out. If any of you have stories, if you were able to just let me know, and we can either create blog posts about that and just have kind of examples of how people have done it, I think is going to be the best way moving forward, because everyone is just so unique that it doesn't make sense for Bridge IQ can't tell everyone exactly what they need to do, but we can at least be the place that you can find the examples, the stories, and some semblance of agreed upon best practices for doing that.
And I'm a little curious, as the two DSpace migrations occurred, what was the experience like there with the?
So one thing that actually, well, all of this would be helpful, but I think that one thing that would be helpful to add to kind of the corpus of content that Bridge to Haiku is creating, or that the metadata, Ruth just ran away, metadata interest group might be creating is scripts in a common programming language, Python or something, that allow you to query and evaluate the metadata that's in common platforms that are out there, right? So DSpace, ePrints, Content DM, so that not everybody has to start at the beginning and get to a place, right? You can kind of dump data out and run the kinds of evaluations that we think we need to do, likely, on the metadata, right? Like show me all the unique values of, these metadata fields or whatever. You can find all your misspellings, right? And OpenRefine is useful in a lot of ways, but there are also other things that we find ourselves having to do. And I wonder if there's a way to kind of hone in on a common set of needs and like data investigations that would be helpful for a lot of different folks. As we
Test.
At UVic, we developed a tool. It's in Node right now, so we're going to move it to a gem because Node is a disaster. But it's called Vaultify because our Haiku instance, we're calling it Vault. And basically, you upload a CSV into that, and it goes through all the data, and depending on what you select for each field, we'll query like OCLC fast or AAT or wherever you want to query to for like an authority, and then standardize all the data for you. And then there's some other features built in, so if you have things that it can't really detect how you want to standardize it, you can tell it what you want and search through like fast, for instance, and get the right value and apply it to all of the values in there that are similar, so that if you change, easy example is a date, for instance, you have a date that's been punched in month day instead of day month or something to that effect. You can tell it to swap them all, and then you can add in extra things and apply it to all that are similar. It's kind of an easier interface than OpenRefine, because OpenRefine, trying to teach catalogers how to use can take a long time. Yeah, and then it spits out another CSV at the end that's been modified and has the URIs and everything in it, and then you can just upload that into Haiku. So that's what we've developed.
I was just, I'm not sure how successful it was because I never really used it, but I was just remembering DPLA's toolkit that they were developing I think it was called CreeCree, that was a sort of aggregation and analysis sort of workflow tool envisioning people, and I think this was people who had public data that wanted to be aggregated into DPLA, but it was handling some of the same sort of use cases of having data, possibly heterogeneous data, that you needed to do that basic analysis and mapping with to get it into DPLA. And I wonder if I don't know if that's a tool that would have any usable code, but just looking at their approaches and the functionality they were working on and maybe lessons learned if it wasn't successful.
And with CDM Bridge, we've been hopefully after the beta and after it's stabilized, we've been thinking of having some sort of kind of dashboard that gives you a kind of just a 10,000-foot overview of what your content DM looks like. So just how many fields that you have and how much data and how many objects, because there's no way in content DM to just find, oh, we have X amount of JPEGs, X amount of PDFs, and right now it's just, we're working on it, but that'll probably be in 2.0 of CDM Bridge.
Can I make a proposal? We've kind of named a lot of different things that we could be looking at. And I think that that's a really good starting point for the interest group to start at least identifying and pulling these things together, following on Steve's recommendation. And if everyone's okay with that, then I think merging maybe the DSpace and Content DM groups and just letting folks know that's what we're up to was probably the next logical step, and go from there. And that was really what I was interested in with getting this panel together, was exactly this, like what's next. I'm really glad you guys were all here, so we could get some feedback as we're kind of thinking about less individual efforts and more of what can we do together. And I'm sure once we have all of those models in front of us for how to do this, we can start finding some similarities and also informing out to the community, because I think that we are going to be seeing a big influx, BPress, some of these other things wanting to move over. So I also don't want to hold people too long if everyone's kind of worn out, and y'all are looking kind of worn out. So yes, is it anything? Anybody? No? Okay, Esme? Last thought? Steve? Okay. All right. Nabila? Okay. All right. Thank you so much, everybody. See you in the morning.